Welcome to a new episode of Amplify Live, where leaders and readers connect with their favorite authors about their latest projects. I'm Jennifer Harvey. If you missed the other episodes of Amplify Live, go to amplifymedia.com and select free resources, the link in the top corner to watch. I'm so excited for our time today. Today, I'm speaking with CEO and founder of the Public Religion Research Institute, Robert Jones. And Jones has been described as a public thinker and leader who takes the public opinion researched at PRRI and offers what's been described as a refreshing blend of historical accounting, soul-searching reflection, and analysis. Hi, Robbie. Welcome to Amplify Live.
Hi, Jennifer. Glad to be here.
If you are joining us live right now, feel free to chat with each other on Facebook and YouTube and post any questions that you have for us there. And at the end of our conversation, the conversation between Robbie and myself, we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. So, Robbie, I'm so excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward for a long time to getting to have a dialogue with you. And in addition to your work with PRRI, you have also written many things. You've authored many books, including your latest book, one of my favorite titles ever, White Too Long, The Legacy of White Supremacy in American Christianity. So I have some questions for you. In the book, White Too Long, you say that it's time for churches to be more vocal about social justice. And I'm wondering if you could start us off by talking a little bit about some of the moments in church history related specifically to racial injustice that you think might actually really shock people to learn.
Well, thanks. And it's great to be with you. Before I jump into that question, you and I have circled around each other and been in kind of virtual space together, but for some we've actually got to sit down and have a conversation. So I'm really happy about that and grateful for all of your work that has helped shape my work. I've cited you, and it's great to just be in conversation. So it's interesting. I mean, I grew up in Southern Baptist churches, and so you might think I kind of knew all there was to know about all of that, but I went to seminary and took Baptist history courses and all of that. But even with that kind of background and experience, when I really started digging into the history of particularly white evangelical churches in the country, but not just white evangelical churches, there were just example upon example upon example. I mean, I think one of the kind of more shocking things that I remember uncovering is this kind of interplay, the way that so I'm from Jackson, Mississippi, and the way that First Baptist Church in Jackson played as this kind of hub of supporting white supremacy in Mississippi, right? And it was the church of the Governor Ross Barnett, one of the most segregationists, who explicitly ran on a segregationist platform in Mississippi, and he was also at the same time the head of the very large men's Sunday school program there at the church, right? A very well-respected member. When he was elected governor, again, after running on a segregationist platform, the church held a special consecration service for him and gave him this big ornate Bible, as he was kind of going into office. The church also had what were commonly known around Jackson as the Hederman brothers, who ran not only the state's largest newspapers, but a couple of television stations as well. And, for example, the Columbia School of Journalism called the Clarion Ledger one of the most racist newspapers in the country. When Martin Luther King's March on Washington happened, for example, the front page of the Clarion Ledger right after that showed only a picture of the National Mall with garbage all over it, and said the headline was National Mall cleanup begins after Negro trash is removed, right?
Wow.
So that's and they were one of the principal supporters of the church, there as well. So, I went to Mississippi College, it was a Baptist college, and I got awarded a scholarship. And after my freshman year, it was the Hetterman Scholarship at this Baptist college. I mean, they were funding things. But they were also the absolute bedrock supporters of segregation and racism and white supremacy in the state, all at the same time.
So can I ask you, how is it that it happens? Because that's not very long ago, right? I mean, besides the scholarship, you described, but even those, the 1950s, 1960s, there's folks still alive. How is it that white churches, especially in the context you're describing, don't remember this history or have failed to pass this on? What do you think's going on with the reason folks might be surprised to hear a story like that, given that we're only talking 40 years ago, 50 years ago?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a great conspiracy of silence, really. And I think that many churches have just wanted to move past it. I've often said that, when you say the word church and civil rights, what most Americans immediately think of is the Black church, right? That served as a hub of organizing and resistance to white supremacy. But what hardly anyone thinks of are the white churches that were part of the massive resistance to civil rights and movements for Black equality in the country. And I think it has been that those churches have been the writers of history. I mean, they were literally controlling the newspapers, right, in Jackson. So what stories got entered in the public record, which ones didn't, all of that was kind of very controlled by the powers that be, who were very interested in, painting a story of innocence around white Christian churches and really wanting to, like, at best, even in retrospect, I think, most white Christian leaders have talked about, oh, well, it was more of a sin of omission, right? That we were sitting on the sidelines when we should have been standing up. But that's not really true. When you read the records, I mean, it was active resistance, to Black equality that we really have to reckon with. And I think it's hard. It's for one reason. It's hard. It's embarrassing. And it calls into question a whole range of what kind of questions like what kind of a theology could allow that kind of thing to go on? And is that theology still with us today? And if it is, goodness, what are we going to do?
Yeah. Yeah. I actually have family from Oxford, Mississippi. And about 2 years ago, and grew up in white evangelical culture in Colorado. But my mother, a couple of years ago, was sharing with me a story she had never told me about my family in Mississippi in the 50s, kind of trying to get a desegregation initiative through their church, which failed. And then I said, oh, okay, well then after it failed, what did my uncle do? And she said, well, there wasn't anything to do. So they just let it go and they stayed in the church. And so I thought, man, what about the children and grandchildren then that were raised in that church? Like, those family legacies of silence are part of those church legacies too, I think, because I had never heard that story until 2 years ago.
Well, I think that's really important, is that it's one of the things I found not in my own family like yours, and as I've been speaking at churches around the country, is that once people begin to tell a story or two, 5 or 6 or 7 come out, right? Because it jars people's memory. It gives people permission to tell these stories. And so even in my own family, where I had talked to my parents a fair amount about our own family's history, which I write about in the book, there was one that didn't come out until the book was published. So it's not in the book.
Wow.
But as I was talking to my parents, and after they read the book, my mom told me that that in the early 1960s, my grandfather was a deacon at a church in Macon, Georgia, and that one of his jobs, his official jobs as a deacon, not just a wink, wink, nod, nod role, but an official role, was for him to stand on the steps right before Sunday morning services started, and to ensure that no Black people entered the sanctuary, to stop them on the steps before they got into the sanctuary, and that was a regular role, to have deacons posted, on the front steps outside the doors, not to welcome people in, but to make sure only white people got in. Wow. And I don't think I would have heard that story had I not done this writing, and had I not started the conversation, right? I may have never have known that story.
Yeah. I have definitely had similar experiences throughout my journey in this work too. I'm going to want us to come back to ask you about some of the implications and what should communities do as these stories start to surface. I'm going to want to make sure we come back to that. But before we go down that path, I want to ask you about the main lines, because you're talking about the Southern Baptists. I was raised in conservative Baptist church contexts. There's a lot of, for 5-6 years now, there's been, of course, a lot of visible critique of white evangelical cultures, given the enabling of the last 5+ years of the political context we're all now trying to survive. But I wonder if you could talk a little bit about mainline Protestants, who I think we have not scrutinized as much, and maybe even the Catholic Church tradition. Are there also things that we'd be surprised to find there in some of those histories, or questions about the theology in those congregations? Could you talk a little bit about the main lines in the Catholic Church?
Yeah, it's really important that this is really not just an evangelical problem that we're describing here, but it's a white Christian problem. So that means in the Protestant world, we typically distinguish between two big groups: the white evangelical Christians, which are the more kind of Southern-based, more conservative theologically groups, and what we often call the mainline Protestant, which are non-evangelical groups. They are typically more kind of upper Midwest and Northeast based, typically more liberal, more educated, and kind of the National Council of Churches crowd. So these are Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and the like. And then there's kind of Catholicism, which has been largely white until very, very recent history has been 90%. White of European descent in this country. And what I was, I think, a little surprised is to find, even as someone who looks at these numbers a lot, is when we look at public opinion data, how similar the views are across white evangelicals, white mainline Protestants, and white Catholics. And then when you look at the history is also more similar than one might suspect. So we've been telling some stories here. So it wasn't until I was in seminary, for example, that I even learned the full history of Southern Baptists and what that word Southern means in the denomination's name. And it means literally that they align themselves with slaveholders. That's really what that division was about. So in 1845, which predates the Civil War, what ended up happening is that white Christians actually had their own secessionist movements that were kind of a dress rehearsal for the political secession that led to the Civil War. Wow. So in 1845, both the Baptists and the Methodists split over the issue of slavery, right? So the Methodists that were part of this more mainline tradition, and the Baptists, part of the more evangelical, same year, 1845, they both split into northern and southern factions over the issue of slavery and whether it was acceptable for Christians to own other people based on the color of their skin. That's what the big division was. So you get the Methodist Episcopal Church North, the Methodist Episcopal Church South, the Southern Baptist Convention, and what then became later the American Baptist Church as well in the North. And that division was there for a long time. The Methodists finally got back together, I think it was the 1930s. But even when they did that, it was notable that they sequestered all of the African American churches into one tiny little district so that it would water down their power among all of. So they didn't let Methodists typically assign churches geographically. So you're part of this geographic unit. But instead, no matter where you were, if you were an African American church and you were United Methodist or you were Methodist, when that merger happened, they created this artificial thing called the central jurisdiction, stuck all the African American churches there, so they essentially have one vote, and instead of having their influence be all over the country. So, and then white Catholics, it was not unusual for African American Catholics to be forced to sit in the back of the church, to wait till everyone else had approached the altar to receive the Eucharist. That was pretty common stuff. And very similarly in New York, even, not in a southern jurisdiction, but in New York, Catholic school children who were African American were all sent to one school. No matter where they lived across the city. If you were white, you went to your local parish school, the ones closer to you. If you were African American, you had to go to this one particular school so that the other Catholic schools could stay all white.
Wow. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about just what role you think. I mean, White Too Long just does this phenomenal job sort of uncovering, unveiling with specifics, really the kind of stories you're sharing with us now. And it's a really painful book to read in that way. But as I was reading it, it was so clear to me that naming these stories, telling these stories is vitally important. And I guess I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the role that, I mean, we don't want to leave it there, but that even bringing into space and verbalizing and recollecting these recent histories plays in thinking about how we move or transform white Christian context to become something different, really, especially in the wake of a political and civic moment where white nationalism is just, knocking on and opening doors all over the place. Could you just sort of talk about why it matters to tell these stories in the context of trying to also grow something different and justice centered in white Christianity?
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's two reasons. And one is that if we take this history seriously, we can't help but conclude that it's done great damage to Christian churches, right? And it's done great. So it's done external damage to African Americans who were discriminated against and justified with white Christian theology. But I think the thing that most white Christians too easily overlook is that done great damage to us, right? To hold that kind of theology, right? So on the one hand, we profess to have a religion of love, a religion of hospitality and acceptance, and we have allowed it to be disfigured by this prior commitment to white supremacy. And like that has to be taken really seriously. There's no way that white supremacy has been welcomed into our congregations the way it clearly has historically and done no damage to our theology, done no damage to our psyches. So if we want to not only heal and repair the damage we've done externally, but we've got work to do to heal the damage that we've done to ourselves and to our own understanding of God, theology, the world, creation, salvation, sin, ecclesiology, right? I mean, all up and down. It has been made to fit with the preconceived commitment that white lives were more valuable than others. And that has infected really the entire project. So it's just vital to tell the truth about that. The only way we heal, the only way we get somewhere different is if we're willing to tell the truth about where we've been.
Yeah. It makes me think about, Dr. James Cone used to talk about, may he rest in peace, that U.S. American white theology, that some of the critiques were, like white Christians believe the right things, but just don't live them out. And he used to say, actually, if you're not living them out, maybe you don't even believe the right things. Like maybe there is something wrong with the theology. And so sort of excavating that is a very significant work. And it's a very daunting work, I think, for many white congregations, and especially white clergy who might be inclined to sort of hear this and be persuaded and think, and how do I do that in a local church context?
Yeah. Well, here I think that it's important if we take seriously, what the New Testament says, right? You'll know them by their fruits. And if we take that seriously and we look with honest and disinterested eyes at the history, I think there's no way that we don't conclude that at many moments we chose to protect white supremacy over our faith, right? Our ancestors did that. We have done that. And I think that's really the challenge, is to kind of go back and say, all right, well, how do we then, make amends? And I think this is a generations long project, right? This is not something we're going to fix in 5 years. I mean, it took generations to get here. I think it's going to take generations to heal, but I think there's a special responsibility for those of us who are alive right here, right now. There's no doubt. I would say, if I'm going to say it theologically, I would say what we're experiencing in the country is a moving of the Spirit, right? We talk about these moments of awakening, and I think there is a kind of moment of reckoning, a moment of the Spirit moving that we're experiencing around racial justice issues, and we have an opportunity, I think, just because of the momentum that's happening, to see things our parents and grandparents couldn't see, and to do something about the things that we're now seeing. I mean, you're really responsible for things when you see them, right? And I think what we're being faced with and asked, there's kind of again, a kind of great cloud of witnesses gathering now, looking at the white church and saying, what now are you going to do? Right. And I think we've got the responsibility to give an answer.
There's a hypothesis I've heard floated about, and maybe it's one that your data, the amazing research PRRI has done helps us with. And so I want to ask you this question about, the well remarked upon decline and shrinkage in white Christianity, especially the mainline Protestant traditions, as I understand it, in recent decades, except for a very recent poll that I also want to ask you about. I want to ask you the question of what kind of correlations you think there might be, or maybe there's not, between the kind of moral complicity that you're talking about, the white Christianity really being called to account for right now, and the decline in the recent decades. Do you think that there may be some kind of correlation between the ways that church communities have been on the decline in terms of membership and the kind of moral questioning about where the white church has been on issues of white supremacy and racism and other kinds of social justice issues? Is that priming the pump? I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's really complex. And so let me just give you the numbers first.
Okay.
So, what we really have been seeing is shifts in the demographics that really began, in the 70s and 80s. They pick up steam in the 90s. And then in the last decade, we've also seen a kind of bigger acceleration of these trends. So just in the last 10 years, let's say since 2008, for example, the country was 54% white, non-Hispanic, and Christian, and as recently as 2008. That number today is 44%, right? So we've gone literally since the beginning of our first African American's president's term in office, from a country that was, descriptively speaking, majority white and Christian, to one that is no longer majority white and Christian. And that has been true among kind of all groups. So the white Catholics have declined, white mainline Protestants have declined. And what's new in the last 10 years is that white evangelicals have declined. And in fact, the decline over the last dozen years has been steeper among white evangelicals than among the other two groups of white Christians. And they've gone from being 21% of the country down to 14.5%. Percent of the country in our latest numbers now. So under 15%. In fact, they're smaller than the mainline denominations are at this point, because that last 10 years has been just really, really steep. So there's a number of things going into it. We've got a lot of news this week about the decline of white Americans overall. So all these numbers are as a proportion of the general population. So part of this is white decline in general. And those reasons are complex. So that's part of it, but we don't get where we are just with that. So the other piece of it is people actually leaving white Christian churches, right? And it has been mostly young people under the age of 40, kind of driving this, accelerating or turbocharging this demographic decline. And there, I think we are kind of in the territory where you're pointing to, that what we do know is that a number of things that these Americans who are kind of born and raised in white Christian churches and then left, and most of them leave by the time they're 20, right? So it's not a post-college thing. It actually happens in their teen years. When we ask them why they've left, I mean, they do cite a number of things that are indicative of the more conservative end, the more evangelical end. So they cite as an important reason they left, negative treatment of or negative teachings about gay and lesbian people or transgender people. That's about a third of them actually say that was an important reason why they left. They cite kind of anti-science things, whether it's evolution or denial of climate change. This is something the younger generation believes, strongly. And they cite the kind of partisanship, the fact that for many white Christians, they have become a wholly owned subsidiary of one political party, the Republican Party, really since Reagan. That also has been kind of a turnoff, right? The seeing kind of like in the last two election cycles, for example, White evangelicals, for example, voted 81% for Trump in 2016. They voted 84% for Trump in 2020. So it actually went up between 2016 and 2020. But the white mainline and white Catholics voted about 6 and 10 for Trump in both elections, right? So still fairly strong majorities voting for Trump. And I think it's that kind of connectedness with one particular party that's also been a turnoff. So I do think it's a complex set of reasons, but it also has certainly had something to do with the kind of hardline stances, I think, and partisan stances that many conservative white churches have taken.
Is it too soon to make speculations about this recent poll then? And you can correct me if I've got it wrong, but I saw Diana Butler Bass writing about this as well. This recent poll that maybe shows an aberrational moment of an uptick. And I want to ask about that because I have a mother who 2017 left the Conservative Baptist Church I was raised in, put a no matter who you are, where you're from sign in her yard, and started visiting a Lutheran church, which I was raised being taught Lutherans weren't Christians. And all of that for her was this really disorienting response to the election of Donald Trump and her horror at that, despite theologically being very aligned with white evangelicalism. And when I saw that poll, I thought, is that, maybe it's too soon to say something with one poll, but I'm just curious what you might gently hypothesize about what that recent poll is, and maybe share with our listeners what that poll was.
Yeah, so it's a great piece that Diana Butler Bass wrote, who is a friend and actually a former board member at PRI, and those are our numbers. Those are PRI numbers that she was writing about. So what's interesting is that over the last 2 years, we saw something that we haven't seen in decades, and that is that among the white non-evangelical Protestants that we can label often mainline Protestants, we saw for the first time not one more number on the downward tick, but actually 2 years of uptick. We saw it first last year, and we didn't really make a big deal out of it because it was one dot, and a long drop. But this year we've got another one, and it's up again. So I think the short answer is it's a little too soon to know exactly what's going on there. But we did see at the same time a slight dip in the unaffiliated. So just circumstantially, what you could say is that what we had experienced over the last dozen years is that when people left white Christian churches, they were kind of none and done, right? They were just out of there, right? And they joined the ranks of the unaffiliated, or the nuns, the NONESs, and that the picture may be becoming more complex. That it may be that we're seeing some not just leaving altogether, but going from Baptist to Methodist or Baptist to Lutheran. So we're still kind of waiting to see what's going on, but the circumstantial evidence indicates that pattern of people just exiting, shutting the door hard, and headed, for kind of the unaffiliated land may not be the only path that people are following lately.
Wow. I would love to imagine ways that if the church, if the church can sort of turn in the ways you're describing and calling it to around this reckoning and a truth telling and a responsive redress of our own histories, if that might also sort of bring new life into the congregations that many of us, dearly love, have been formative to our identities, are how we, where we break bread. And, it gives me some hope, I think, that there might be this really profound opportunity for the church to do something different that also might, bring new life where we have had, a racist death culture before. So I'm just, my mind is spinning with all of the possibilities that might foretell. So I want to ask you, before we turn to some questions from the audience, there's many coming in. Could you give us some advice for local congregations, members of congregations, clergy, who are really trying to think about, how do I stay part of this congregational environment, or how do I lead this congregation in a way that really does begin to journey us towards a kind of reckoning with this history, I just wonder if there's specific strategies, specific wisdoms you have to offer about what local communities can or maybe already are doing to try and really face and, repent, but create an environment in which that's possible, because this can be really, really difficult at the local level, I think.
No, absolutely. And, one of the reasons why it's difficult is, like you said, is that, this history is not that far back there, right? So it's, like I said, I write in the book, I remember the first African-American kid showing up to my public school in third grade, in Mississippi. That's how long Mississippi drug its feet after Brown v. Board of Education, 20 years, so it's not that far back there. And it means that this history is not abstract. This history is about what one generation back, how they handled, things. And so, the names that we're talking about are still the names sitting in the pews with us, especially in small towns. And so that's a really serious, and challenging thing. So, I did resist the urge in the book to, put here's my 10-step plan, at the book for fixing all this, because I do think it has to be a little more organic and local. And also I didn't have a 10-step plan. So, so rather than make one up, what I tried to do in the book was highlight a couple of communities that were just trying to do this work. And I think one of the things that I know you've done that work as well. And, when you do that, what you see is that anything that's real is messy. Right. It kind of flounders around a little bit. It hits some dead ends and some cul-de-sacs, has to regroup. But I actually think that that's the sign of something authentic going on, not anything wrong. Right. Because there's no real blueprints for this. But, what I've said is that not to sound overly simplistic, but I do think it's helpful if we can just kind of boil it down, because I think the initial reaction, for me included, is to just feel overwhelmed and paralyzed because you just feel so overwhelmed, right? You don't know where to start. I would say just pick a spot, right? So pick somewhere to start. Sometimes a simple place to start is to ask the question, if you're in a white church, predominantly white church or white denomination, how did our church become planted where it is? And why is it on this block and not somewhere else in the city? And if you just ask that question, often that will get you pretty quickly. Because if it's not an old church and it's in a new suburb, well, why did it get planted out here in this suburb? Is this a white flight suburb? Why here and not in a more place kind of closer to the center of downtown? Did it move? And when the church moved, why did it move? A lot of those stories are about white flight. My church that I grew up in is no longer in Southwest Jackson. It's up in Madison. It actually disbanded, but a big chunk of the membership kind of ended up at a different church in Madison, Mississippi, which is on the kind of second tier white flight edge of the city. So I think asking those questions and then just kind of looking around, what if there's stained glass in the church, what images are there? And when people are depicted, are they all white? Or do they look all European? And what message does that send? What do the Sunday school materials look like that kids are using? Are they show a diversity of human experience? Or are they, all out of the Baptist Sunday School Board, in Nashville, and look pretty white? So I think little things like that, but I think telling our histories is a really good place to start. And most churches have been around any period of time have these glossy histories they've written about themselves, but they're fantasies, right? They are always the four noble founding families that can do no wrong, and they're rose-colored glasses kind of things. But I think trying to go back and say, okay, let's tell a little more honest history of who we are. Where were we in the civil rights movement? Where have we been during the Black Lives Matter movement? What have we said? Where have we been silent? And why, right? And then I guess another question is, are we in community with anyone who doesn't look like us? Right. That's the other key thing that I've kind of gotten from observing the successful models, I think, that I've seen in white churches have both been because they have done their own due diligence in terms of truth telling about their own history, and they've been willing to risk being in community with churches of color at the same time, right? And those two things I think have kind of helped them along the way.
I love that response so much. a bunch of stuff about it. One, the piece around feeling overwhelmed, pick something. And the local history, how did our church come to be in this neighborhood? Why is it here? To me, if I think about my own location in Des Moines and how housing segregation patterns, where interstates got built, what that does to school districts, when we tell that local history of where our congregation is, all of a sudden, we also might find out that our neighbors are still here with whom we actually really need to be in community relative to then also taking responsibility for the history our congregations have been part of. So it's really like there's churches of color in most contexts leading and working on these issues that they're living with relative to the church, the same histories that our churches have often benefited from. And we can build relationships in those ways. I love that answer so much. Local.
Yeah, let me just put a point on that. I mean, one of the things too that I discovered kind of digging through the history is that it's not the case that we've largely failed on this front in terms of kind of white Christians being accountable to civil rights movement and the movements for Black equality. It's not that we failed because the denominations didn't put out statements.
Right.
Like if you kind of went and just read all the denominational statements, you'd think that, man, every white Christian church was like marching in their local civil rights parade, every time it happened.
And we've been given reparations too, if you read those statements.
Yeah, right. So, but I think that the key really is, I mean, yes, you definitely need kind of national leadership, and that provides a kind of structure, but it's really insufficient for change at the local level. I mean, the history just, even the Catholic Church, I mean, there was like 4 decades that the National Council of Bishops put out a statement on racial justice in the country. And every 10 years, they would begin with, 10 years ago, we put out this statement and we're largely still where we were today, yes. Right? And so I think it's just because it never got down. Brian Massengale, Father Brian Massengale, who's a great Catholic scholar, did these studies, right? And he actually interviewed Catholic parishioners and asked, how many times have you heard a sermon on racial justice or anything related to that? And it was like almost none, despite the fact that, and he asked them over the entire 4-year lectionary cycle. So that means that what they sat there, they listened to their priests preach through the entire text of the Bible. And almost never did the priest find a moment to give a sermon on racial justice and racial equality, right? And so it hasn't gotten down. So I think there's never been a more important time for local pastors, clergy, and lay leaders to step up and really be the change, because that is really how it's going to happen, is at the local level.
Yeah. Which also means those of us that are listening here right now and are part of this dialogue right now, we all have a role to play. It's not going to come from somewhere else. And there's no 10-point plan in your book, in part because we're the ones that have to actually write the plan. That's the work and that's the call. Wow, this is amazing. I would love to keep talking to you and asking my questions. I think, though, that would be unfair. We've got a lot of questions in the audience, so I'm going to turn to those, Robbie, if that's okay. And so let's see here. We're going to start with a theology question. Someone's asking, so how do we address the chosen theology that leads to supremacist actions? I think this is a really important question.
Yeah, I do too. And I had to confess something here, is that there's a very important piece of kind of theological doctrine that even after seminary and a PhD, I knew nothing about. And that is this thing that is called the doctrine of discovery. And it goes way back to 1493. If that date sounds familiar, it should, right? It is the year after 1492 and Columbus visit here. And it is the European Christian church that's before the Protestant Reformation. So there's just one kind of Catholic church. It is the Pope issuing an edict, basically, that says that if any kind of European-based explorer encounters people in the world who are not Christian, they have permission to dominate claim the land, dominate the people in the name of Christianity and the state. And this is the kind of missionary impulse. And you talk about chosenness. I mean, it is basically saying that this particular expression of European Christianity, right, is such the chosen way that God wants to kind of communicate with the world, that violence and subjugation are justified, right? And the equation was always, well, if violence and theft of lands are a small price to pay for inheriting civilization and salvation, right? That was the equation, and this was the kind of blessed by the church equation that much of the colonial enterprise got off the ground with, that lands on the shores of this country, and that we inherit and have largely not interrogated, that much. And so I think we have to start there, right? That this tie between a kind of superiority of white European civilization and that Christianity was the expression of that, is so deep in our DNA that it's going to take a lot to kind of unpack that. But decentering, again, it's kind of back to this, decentering this. I mean, that is literally white supremacy, right? It is that God has chosen Europeans as the supreme example of humanity, and the church has kind of blessed them to kind of use whatever force is necessary to spread Christianity and that version of European civilization. And that's just deep. And it justifies Native American genocide and removals, slavery. It's all at the root of that version, that conceptualization of how God sees European Christians in the world.
Mm. Seems like that's gone even beyond the church too, that it's almost like now that's like also American theology in some ways.
Oh, sure. It's like manifest destiny, right? But it's important to remember it's a Christian doctrine, right? So this whole idea of manifest destiny doesn't get off the ground without the blessing and the moral authority of the Christian church.
Mm. Mm. So we have another excellent question I think is also vitally important right now, which is how are those of us working for inclusive, progressive, working to create an inclusive, progressive society, a justice-infused society, how can we create dialogue with white evangelical churches who are still embracing or are more inclined to explicitly embrace forms of white nationalism? Can we? Must we? What do we need to do?
It's really hard. I tend to think that, we first get our own houses in order. It's kind of, I guess, my first thing I would say is that it's really tempting as someone who's kind of come out of that evangelical world, and I don't consider myself within it these times. It's easy from the outside to kind of point the finger that direction. I would say, from what everything I know about even the white mainline worlds and the white Catholic worlds, and through the white mainline world that tends to think of itself as more progressive, more liberal, and there's truth to that. But I think there's a real danger there of missing, again, like it was United Methodist, it was the Methodist Church that split in 1845 as well as the Baptist Church did. It was the Methodist Church that kept all African Americans segregated, right, here. It was the Episcopal Church that was the church of Robert E. Lee and Jefferson Davis. Right, the leaders of the Confederacy. Those weren't Baptists; they were Episcopalians, right? And so I guess at first I want to say, doing enough stuff that kind of transforms kind of our own spaces, first, and kind of being in conversation with churches of color across the community, and that kind of example may do more than anything else. I can't say that at this moment in our congregational life, the big debates, I think, aren't where it's going to happen. I think it's going to be like we're going to live out our lives as an example, provide an alternative, and a different vision of what it means to be Christian, right? And what it means to be white and Christian in particular. And I think that's where the work really is. I don't waste a lot of time sparring, with people. I'm trying to push the other work forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I appreciate that a lot. So, Robbie, we have about 2 or 3 questions that raise the question of reparations. I'm going to share one of them, but there's a number that sort of ask about this. This participant puts it this way: should we as white Christians be confessing, repenting, and making amends? And are reparations the only way we can make amends? And I think I would add to that, are they a way to make amends? A few number of folks are curious to hear you talk about reparations.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting. I mean, I do talk about reparations in the book, but the vocabulary I use mostly for it is repair and repentance, because I think these are more appropriately and properly Christian concepts. And I really think if we're talking about Christian congregations, that's the conversation we really need to have, is what, instead of sort of, I think, starting with reparations, which for many white people, because it's going to cost us something, have a very defensive initial reaction to that word. I think the better starting place for this question is, what does repentance look like, right? And if we really ask that question, it's going to lead us where it leads us at the end of the day, right? So, because I think as long as we're having these kind of intellectual debates about reparations, we're stuck. Because I think really we're talking about a movement of the spirit and the heart that gets us to let go of our dollars at the end of the day, right? And so, if we don't think it's like something we begrudgingly are giving, but something that we realize we illegitimately have and are returning, right? That's a very different, for example, that's a very different concept. So I think it's really that. I think it has to be on the table. I think the conversation has to be, if we really understand our history, if we're in relationship with people that we've wronged, and we really want to repent, what does it look like? And I do think inevitably it's going to mean that our bank accounts are not going to look like they look like now. Our endowments are not going to look like they look like now. I mean, one of the big questions for me is particularly for older denominations that have literally billions of dollars in assets that are tied up in property endowments, university and seminary endowments. And much of that money was accumulated 100 years ago, 150, 200 years ago on the backs of enslaved people. And what's our responsibility for that? If we know that history and we take that history seriously, and we think about things like investing and compound interest over time, where does that lead us, right? If we really want to be faithful. And again, I think to think about, this is part of our own growth, right? Again, it's not just an altruistic move, right? But there's certainly both, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament both tell us, do not come to the altar if you get something wrong between you or your brother and your sister, right? You go make that right first, then you come to worship God. That's the only way to do it properly and authentically. And so, I think these verses have got to become less, abstract to us and actually mean something on this front.
So someone is reminding us and wanting to ask about voting rights legislation. This participant says, a good start to the healing process would be for white Christians to find the courage to speak out robustly in support of the current proposed voting rights legislation. I'm wondering what you might say about that, and what kinds of things are you seeing things happening on this front from predominantly white religious communities? Yeah.
Well, I would say, one of the things I learned, like kind of just observing churches that were doing work in this space, is that showing up is huge. There are many things that white churches do not have to show up for because their rights are already protected. Things are going pretty well for them. Not a lot is on the line. And I think the voting rights place is, particularly if you're in Georgia, if you're in Texas, other places where some of these laws are really draconian. White churches showing up would be hugely meaningful here, when they're kind of, showing up not just to protect kind of our own rights, but the rights of everyone. And I think that's huge. I think it's really important because, again, we could put a lot of words out there, but I'll give you one example. Churches in Macon that I write about in the book, they got together and formed this kind of covenanted community, not just months before Trayvon Martin was killed. And the pastor of the white church, Scott Dickinson, told me, he said, look, I would like to think that we would have shown up for our Black brothers and sisters after the killing of Trayvon Martin, even if we hadn't been in this covenanted relationship, but I'm not sure we would have, to be honest. But because we were in this relationship and we knew that people that we loved were hurting and fearful and angry, we knew we had to show up, right? Because we were in relationship with these people. And I think that, again, just kind of is the key to it. And all of this becomes, the reason why this is so abstract, I think, is because most white Christians aren't in relationship with anybody who's not white and Christian. And I think once those kind of boundaries get broken down, again, these questions become less abstract and they become matters of community and matters of friendship, right? And then we're there. So I think we both have to sort of think about these things as a matter of principle. And I think, yes, white Christians showing up on voting rights is really important. And I think also it'll be less abstract and less of something to debate, and just something we do when we're in relationships, where it will matter.
Mm-hmm. Which goes back to what you said earlier about where we start. Like, where's our church planted and who are we in community with?
Yeah.
We as humans, we always are more likely to show up with persistence and loyalty and urgency when it's folks that we're closer to, right? When our bandwidth is maxed, but I'm going to show up for those I perceive as family, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This gets into another kind of area that I think is important that churches, white folks in churches struggle with. And someone asked a question that touches on it too, about friendship and relationship. The question that someone's asking is, are white attendees welcome in Black churches? And is the reverse also true? So this question of like, who can we be in relationship? And so this chicken egg problem that I sometimes bump into, in which we're more likely to show up when we have relationships, interracial relationships that are real. And also sometimes white folks, there's some challenge in, we kind of want to find a Black friend, but we're not maybe ready to be a good friend, right? So have you bumped into this or thought about this, intervene in this chicken and egg problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's why I think most of the models that we see are actually a predominantly white church, and they're not all white, right? And a predominantly African-American church forming a partnership together, because it means that there's kind of a safe home base for each group in many ways. And then there's places where they come together and places where they can kind of come apart and have their own conversations. And I think just given our history, our fraught history, that often works pretty well. On the individual churches, I would say, like, if you're a white person and wanting to be in community, I would just go talk to the pastor about it, right? Tell them where you are. Here's what I'm thinking. Give me some help, here. Just have the conversation about it. I mean, and I think the thing to do, particularly from the white side of the equation, is to realize that there is a tremendous amount of distrust, right? That's been built from this fraught history. So, a white person showing up and saying, let's be in community, isn't always an easy sell, given that history, right? There's like, well, to what end, what for, what's going, there's lots of questions like that. And so it is really tough, given our histories. And I think that's why kind of small steps, kind of along the way are really the way to go. But I think, people following their heart, trying to do what's doing, but I think being conscious that, particularly if you're white, of those legitimate suspicions, right, on the hand, and being really sensitive about those things is really important. Being
willing to push through a little discomfort too. It sounds like I'm used to being welcomed and embraced, maybe, but I'm going to persist even if I feel a little out of my comfort zone. Yeah. There's a couple of questions, Robbie, about critical race theory, of course. Sitting here on my college campus, we're talking about this here. And so a couple of questions, wondering if you could talk a little bit about critical race theory denial, or how much the anti-CRT fracas, I think is what I've been thinking we should call it, is churches are getting caught up in that. If you could help folks sort of parse their way through that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think before say anything, the real question for me is why this debate now, right? And let's just start there. Why this debate now? And I think the clear question or answer to that question is that it's a defensive response to a call once again for Black equality, right? And to the Black Lives Matter movement, to that we saw across the last year, to some successes, right? For example, of removing the Confederate monuments from Richmond, the former capital of the Confederacy, after they've been there for well over 100 years. And so I think it is no doubt in our history that what we see is that when we see steps forward for civil rights and movements for Black equality, we always see a backlash, always. This is just textbook backlash movement here, right? So when we're calling for an accounting of our history, we're calling for more truth telling. That's going to be hard truths to tell for many white people and for white Christians in particular. There is always the sense to avoid something that's going to be deeply uncomfortable, and most of these movements are really just that. There is no grand critical race theory debate. What there is a propaganda movement that is being motivated by deep discomfort of having to face the music of what the real history in this country looks like. And I think that's really, it's just kind of a cherry-picked bogeyman that sounds scary if you talk about it the right way and hold your face just right. But at the end of the day, it's smoke and not a lot of fire, and just so clearly motivated by a defensive reaction among conservative white Americans and conservative Christians. And it's really simply an attempt to put a cloth over the mirror, as one way I would put it too. Right? No, we're not going to look into that mirror, and we're not going to have our kids look into that mirror. And that's really the beginning and the end of it, in my opinion.
Wow, I really appreciate that you said it's not really a debate; it's a propaganda move. Because I find myself wondering how much we engage and respond to it and try and demystify, and how much that just gives oxygen to something that's really kind of it's not a fightable foe because it's not real, but it's very real, but it's not real. Hard.
If you ask the 6 Southern Baptist seminary presidents last fall 2020, came together and made this joint statement. There's 6 seminaries within Southern Baptist life. They're some of the biggest seminaries in the country. And the 6 presidents came together and denounced critical race theory as incompatible with the Baptist faith and message, which is like the creedal, document within Southern Baptist. I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, that in the entire history of Southern Baptists, there has never been a time when 6 Southern Baptist presidents got together and denounced anything.
Wow.
So again, if you say why this, why now?
Yeah.
They're all men, they're all white. Right, and they're heading the educational future of a denomination that again was founded to justify and bless the enslavement of people on the basis of the color of their skin. That's the history of the denomination, and in 2020, they still think this is a authentic Christian thing to do. And I think it's just purely a circle the wagons move to try to defensively not look at their own history.
Wow. Yeah, Baptists don't agree on anything.
Yeah, right. There should have been seven statements instead of 1 out of 7.
That's right. Robbie, we are almost out of time. I want to give you the opportunity. I wonder if there's anything I didn't ask you about that you would like to offer as a parting word, or if there's anything as we get ready to move away from this time and space that you would want to just say to folks who are listening, who really, want to be in this journey of bringing something different into white Christianity. Sort of last word is yours before we get ready to sign off.
Right. Well, I feel like this conversation rightly has been, a little difficult, a little uncomfortable because of what we're talking about. But I'll end with this. When I turned in the book manuscript, it was the fall of 2019. And I was honestly in a pretty dark place when I turned that manuscript in. I was kind of down. It was a kind of heavy lift to write the book. I would say I'm more hopeful today than I was when I turned the manuscript in. And I'll give you just a couple of examples. Not only the kind of points of light that I've seen in the kind of churches I wrote about in the book, but I've done about 70 virtual because of COVID speaking engagements across the country in the last year and a half since the book came out, and I've just been really inspired because they've been largely with white Christian congregations that are trying to have these conversations. Main chance, a number of times that they've been partnered with a local African American congregation. I've talked to them both at the same time. And I don't think I've seen any kind of critical mass like that happen in my lifetime. So I think the reason why we're seeing a lot of these negative pushback things is because there are real changes happening. They're slow. They're sometimes hard to see. And I think if you're in, I've lived in Springfield, Missouri, and Atlanta, and Jackson, Mississippi, and all across the South. And I think when you live in communities that do have a more conservative, bent to them, it's hard to feel like there's progress being made. But I can say from just my experience that I do think that there's change coming and change happening that's real. That's again different than I've seen in my lifetime, and I think that gives me a lot of hope, including like one story I tell about Mississippi, just real quick, is that, again, not a perfect story, but, since 1894, my home state has had the Confederate battle flag as part of the flag of its state flag, right up in the corner. As a result of, and there's been a 20-year movement to try, at least 20 years, to get serious movement to try to get that removed. That's had no traction at all. But in 2020, after George Floyd's murder and the Black Lives Matter movements, within the span of just that summer, the legislature passed a law removing the Confederate battle flag from the flag, and none other than the Mississippi Baptist Convention was one of the first people to endorse that move and to encourage the governor to sign the bill. Now, like, that's not something, if you'd asked me to bet on that, when I turned in the manuscript of this book, I would have given you long odds on that. And today, and in January this year was the first time that the new flag went up that has a magnolia on it. It's a kind of beautiful blue flag with a magnolia in the middle, no Confederate symbols, anywhere on it. Now, again, it's a symbol, but I think it is an indication, that things are really, really changing. And I think that the resistance we're feeling is because of those changes. And, it's just time for us to all put our shoulders to the wheel and keep pushing forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you for those words. Thank you for this conversation. Thank you for your book and also for your courage and your leadership on this. We're going to say goodbye to you right now, Robbie, with so much gratitude for all that you're offering in this really important moment in our country and in our religious communities. Thanks.
No, thank you. It's been great to be with you.
Thanks. Thank you all, listeners, for joining us. Thank you so much for your questions, for your good and your important questions. I want to make sure that Robbie has a new video study based on his book, and it's available on Amplify Media, only on Amplify Media. When you go to the webinar page, you'll find that the first episode is available to watch for free. And if you haven't already, you can subscribe to Amplify Media's Facebook and YouTube pages to watch future webinars like this one. Thank you to Amplify Media for sponsoring this series. Visit amplifymedia.com to learn more about the resources that they provide to churches. Have a wonderful week, and thank you all again.